Welcome back to lesson 3 of my series on Hebrew thought in the New Testament. And originally, I didn't plan on doing a lesson 3, but after I got done with the second lesson, I was asked a few questions afterwards. And I kind of felt like maybe the answer to some of those questions sort of deserved a third part. So I'm going to go ahead and cover a lot of that. Now, in the first 2 lessons, I focused a lot on the Gospels and on Paul. And someone asked me afterwards whether it was in other places, such as letters other than Paul or the book of Revelation. And the short answer to that is yes, it's all over the place, basically. I focused on the Gospels and on Paul, largely because those were sort of the two extremes. The Gospels is where you expect to see this kind of thing the most, since you've got a Jewish man talking to a Hebrew-speaking audience. And Paul was kind of the place where you expect to see this the least. The reason I say that is because he was the apostle appointed to the Gentiles, and most of his letters were written to Greek-speaking societies. And so that's probably the place that, because of the audience, you would least expect to see it, but it's there. Now, there are other places, and I guess the fact that, in order to show you, no, this doesn't really rest completely on 2 authors, since a lot of Mark and Luke probably came ultimately from the Gospel according to Hebrews and therefore ultimately from Matthew. But just to demonstrate to you that no, this doesn't rest on just 1 or 2 authors, and that this is something that is very much a trend everywhere, let me give you another example. And this one comes from James, or Yaakov, chapter 4, verse 7, where he says, "Resist Satan and he will flee from you." Now, when he says resist Satan, what are we resisting? Well, what we are resisting is temptation. And that word would be spelled in Hebrew as nun, samek, he, which we would pronounce nisa. And it's when he says, and he will flee from you, well, there's definitely a connection there, because the word flee would be pronounced nun, samek, and you just simply wouldn't have the he. And so there's definitely a connection between temptation and flee in Hebrew thought. And this, of course, is coming from somebody who you might expect to see it a little bit more than from Paul, because we know that James, or Yaakov, stayed in Israel and ministered to the Israeli believers there in Israel. So you would be more likely to expect to see this from him. But it's another example of the same type of thing that I already showed you through several examples in Paul's letters. Now, I guess another reason that someone asked about the book of Revelation is, first of all, partly because it's a big book. And in addition to being a big book, of course, one that is significant in terms of importance. And there is also a place here in the book of Revelation where this type of thing also exists. And I'm going to cover that next. I gave you one example from the book of Revelation before, and that was the example of the white stone. And of course, the white stone example, that was a good example. Just to show you that that's not an accident or a coincidence, let me show you some other places where it appears. In the 7 letters, we find that there is something very interesting going on, because there's a very intriguing connection between the punishments and the rewards. And what I'm going to share with you right now is something that I cover in my book on the 7-city pattern. But so you could find this example in there, but this is a really great example of Hebrew thought in the New Testament. And I suppose another reason why the book of Revelation is probably something that's considered important is because it wasn't preserved in the Aramaic canon, and it's one of the books of the New Testament whose best and most original copy probably is in the Greek, since it was not preserved in the Aramaic canon. And I know that there are some people who have tried to allege that there's an Aramaic version of it, but I think every copy in Aramaic is pretty much a translation from the Greek. So that's another reason I think people are interested in the book of Revelation. However, in the letters, there is a reward and a punishment described in each letter, or in some cases it's not a punishment but a warning of a suffering. rather than a punishment. However, in each of the cases, the reward and the punishment are tied together in Hebrew thought. Now, in some cases, they are tied together through the Hebrew thought connected by the name of the city. And I'm not going to explain that here. I do explain that in my book. I'll leave that for you guys to read about in the book. But I am going to cover, but because that would take laying a very lengthy foundation, I'm not going to cover that at the moment. But I do want to cover how the rewards and punishments are linked together in Hebrew thought that I can easily explain to you right now without laying a lengthy foundation. In the letter to Ephesus, the key word here is gana. We find that both the reward and the punishment are related by the word gan or gana, because the punishment says, I will come to you quickly and remove your lampstand out of its place unless you repent. The reward says that to he who overcomes, I will give to eat of the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God. The phrase paradise of God, usually that is described as Gan Eden, or the Garden of Eden in Hebrew terminology. And so there you have the word Gan. Now, if you take the word Gan and make it feminine, then you've got the word Gana, which means to censure or to punish in some way. And of course, that's what's happening here in Revelation 2:5. He's warning about a Gana, about a punishment, about being censured somehow. So, we see that both the reward and the punishment are connected together in Hebrew thought through a word that is common and is, in a way, present behind the two. In some ways, you can think of this as a wordplay, maybe more of a wordplay than the same root word, but it still exists. And you might write this off as a coincidence, but if it happens every time in every letter, then it's not a coincidence anymore. It's actually the discovery of a pattern. At that point, it's a pattern and not a coincidence. Now, in the case of the letter to Smyrna, that one is connected. The rewards and the punishment are connected together through the meaning, the Hebrew meaning of Smyrna. If you take Smyrna and spell it in Hebrew, I'm not going to go into detail on that. I do in my book, but that one would be a little bit lengthier. So I'm going to skip forward to Pergamos and talk about that one. Now, in Pergamos, the rewards and punishments are connected together by the same Hebrew word. Well, two words spelled the same way but pronounced differently and meaning something differently. The key word here would be spelled Samak Tav Resh. And let's take a look at what it says so we can see how they connect together through that. It says, the punishment is, I will come to you quickly and fight against them with the sword of my mouth. Now, keep in mind when he says that, when he says, I will fight them with the sword of my mouth, he doesn't mean that he's going to spill their blood. What that means is he's going to engage in a war of words. He's going to rebuke them by logically explaining to them why they're wrong. The reward is, to he that overcomes, I will give to eat of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone, and in that stone a new name written, which no man knows except he that receives it. Now, I explained in a previous lesson about the white stone, and that's definitely Hebrew thought, but there's more Hebrew thought here in this letter. Because both of these concepts are tied together by the Hebrew word spelled Samak Tav Resh. When that word is pronounced satar, it can mean to refute or to contradict, and that is the topic of the punishment, because the punishment is all about refuting or contradicting a false line of thinking here. When it's pronounced seter, it refers to a secret. And of course, here in Revelation 2:17, we see a secret being talked about. It says the hidden manna, and it talks about a white stone with a name written on it that is, of course, a secret except to one person. So both the reward and the punishment are connected together in Hebrew thought by a Hebrew word that can be spelled Samak Tav Resh. This is not an accident. It's very much an intentionally planned part of the letter. And if we go on to verse 18, we can actually, I talked about the white stone before, but in verse 18 we can also see that the white stone was not an accident, because there is some evidence to the fact that that was a planned association and not just a coincidence, because in verse 18 it goes on to talk about the sun. So there's Ben again, and it says that his feet are like, in most English translations, it says fine brass or burning brass or something like that. The Greek word that's used in that spot is actually kalko labano. And, of course, labano is, in reality, the Hellenization of a Hebrew word. It's not a Greek word. Labano is not a Greek word at all. They actually took the Hebrew word for white and just simply imported it into the Greek language and Hellenized it, the grammar to it, and sort of created a new word. But, and of course that word would basically means that, not burning brass, but whitening is what it really means. It doesn't mean burning, it means whitening. And of course it does turn into something white when it's in the fire. So that's one of the reasons why it'll say burning in a lot of translations. And that's why it's not, the phrase is, burning is not really a wrong translation. It's just not as literal. But the fact that it's there sort of proves that the whole white stone association in verse 17 was not an accident, but also a planned part. And that what you've got here in 2:16 and 2:17, Setter is the Hebrew thought that connects 2:16 and 2:17 together. And of course, Ben, Avon, Laban, and so forth is the Hebrew thought connecting verses 17 and 18 together. Thyatira is the next city, and in the rewards and punishment of it, we see that there is definitely a connection with the Hebrew word that can be spelled Mem Tav He. It says in chapter 2, verse 22, I will cast her into a bed, and them that commit adultery with her into great tribulation, unless they repent of their deeds. And the reward is described like this. He that overcomes and keeps my words to the end, to him I will give power over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. As the vessel of a potter, they shall be broken to shivers. Even as I received from my Father, I will give him the morning star. Now, as you can see on the screen, if you can see the screen and you're not listening to this on the radio, the word bed and rod are spelled the same way in Hebrew, and I've kind of shown that here on the screen. And they're not pronounced the same way, but if you pronounce the Hebrew word that you see here on the screen, spelled Mem, Tet, He, if you pronounce it Mitah, you've got a word that can mean bed. And she's, in this passage, is thrown on a bed. But if you pronounce it Muteh, it can mean either tribe or support. And what's happening here, she's being thrown on the bed with the tribe that supported her. So, again, Hebrew thought here in the punishment. Now, it can also be pronounced to mean injustice. And of course, she acted unjustly. When it's pronounced matah, it can mean down. And of course, she's going to be tossed downward onto the couch. But also, we understand that in the final punishment, she's going to be tossed downward towards the center of the earth in the place of torment. Now, when this word is pronounced mateh, it can mean either rod, and you can kind of see the connection between rod and support because you use a rod as support. So there is some connection in these thoughts. But the content of all of this, there's a lot of content in here that is all connected together in Hebrew thought. You've got the bed, you've got her being cast down, you've got the tribe that supports her, you've got the iron rod. So a lot of different thoughts here are all connected by the same Hebrew word. Again, this isn't an accident, it's a planned part of the pattern. In the letter to Sardes, we've got both a punishment and a reward connected together. And here you've got, it says, remember how you have received and heard, this is in verse 3 of chapter 3, and hold fast and repent. If you do not watch, I'll come to you as a thief, and you won't know what hour I'll come. In verse 5, he says, to he who overcomes, the same shall be clothed in white raiment, and I will not blot out his name of the book of life. So, these two things are connected together in Hebrew thought by the Hebrew word beged, which can either mean clothing or betrayal. We see clothing being discussed in the reward, and we see betrayal being discussed in the punishment. In the case of Philadelphia, the reward and punishment there's actually two key words involved. One is spelled chet beit resh, and the other is spelled ayin mem dalet. Let me explain both. Now, it says the punishment says, I will make them come and worship before your feet and know that I have loved you. The reward says, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go no more, and I will write upon him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, which is the New Jerusalem, and I will write upon him my new name. Now, the Hebrew word that is spelled chet beit resh can be pronounced cheber. When it's pronounced cheber, it means to write something. But when it's pronounced chavar, it refers to someone who's a partner or an associate or a friend in some way. Somebody that you have somehow been joined together with in some way. Now, this connection exists. There's actually definitely a connection between those different thoughts. We think of these things as two completely different things in English, but they are connected together in Hebrew thought by the fact that when you write something on a piece of paper, what are you doing? You're joining ink to the paper. So there is a joining together aspect to writing something. And of course, you're also putting thoughts on a surface, an ideal on a surface that previously didn't have an ideal. So there is a joining that goes on when you write something. And that's why this connection actually exists in Hebrew. You remember, you can slice an onion a bunch of different ways, and, you look at it one way, it might look different than another, and different people in different languages kind of slice up thought ideas in different ways as well. But these seem like they're far more connected in Hebrew thought than what they seem like in English thought or in Greek thought. But the reward involves writing. There's the chaber, meaning it involves writing a name that indicates you are God's associate. There's the chavar part in some way. The punishment involves punishing those who falsely claim to be such an associate or a chavar. So, now this is pretty significant. Now, the word worship here in Revelation 3:9 really means to just bow down, but it implies worship. The Hebrew word for pillar here is amud, and it comes from the root word for stand, which is spelled ayin mem dalet. Now, when we talk about a pillar in Hebrew thought, we're sort of describing it as standing. We're sort of describing it as something that rises from its base. Now, in another language, who knows, they might describe it as something that drops from the ceiling. Okay? Or, pillar seems like a neutral word in English. It doesn't seem, we're not really in English describing it with a word that means rising from the base or dropping from the ceiling. It's just something that's sort of all there. Actually, maybe there is an association in English because pillar sort of comes from pile, and pile is something that sort of rises from the base. So maybe in English we're sort of describing it as something that's rising from the base as well. But you could be, different languages might be using a neutral word or one direction or the other direction. Okay? Now, if you drop the last letter and you just have ayin mem, you've got a word that means people. And of course, this verse is talking about not just any group, but which people is most closely associated with God. So there's a chavar, and it is perhaps for that reason that we actually have two keywords going on here, because one of the main things about the reward is what people is associated with God, and maybe that's why we've got two words here going on. Now, this isn't just simply by chance or wordplay. A people here, in Hebrew thought, it's actually considered to be, when you talk about a people and spelled ayin and mem, it's actually sort of describing it as a flow from one generation to another, because ayin can be a fountain. You could think of it as something that things spring forth from, and mem can can often be thought of as a flow. So you put them together, you're actually describing a flow from a fountain. And of course, almost every word in Hebrew thought, for those of you that have read my book, The Creative Forces, you may know that every word in Hebrew thought has meaning contributed to that word from the meaning of the individual letters. Each of the individual letters have meaning, and the words that they spell out have meaning that is composed from the individual letters. So, that's why I say that you can think of a people as they flow from one generation to another. And a pillar, of course, is something that's flowing. It flows upward from the base. Now, it was this connection, and for this reason, that God chose to use a pillar as a symbol of who is really part of his people in this passage and what group of people is truly considered to be Jewish by God. The punishment of bowing at the feet is really a play on the reward, which is a pillar. The Hebrew thought is the basis for what drives the symbolism in much of the book of Hebrew, whether it's written out in Hebrew or not. And this passage is not about which group of Greek people are approved by God, but which group of people is considered to be Jewish. So the use of the word Jewish there helps us try to focus on the Hebrew thought behind this reward and punishment, and not the Greek thought or not the English thought or something else. And in the case of the last letter, Laodicea doesn't threaten the punishment, but just describes a state of suffering that is in need of repair here. But both the suffering and the reward are connected together through a Hebrew word that can be spelled Yud, Shin, Beit. The suffering says this: because you say I am rich and increase with goods and have need of nothing, you do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. And the reward says, to him who overcomes, I will grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I overcame and sat down with my Father in his throne. Now, the Hebrew word yeshiva is actually built from yeshav, and it can be translated either sitting or school. Yeshav can mean to sit or to dwell. The word school is sort of built from that. Yeshiva is sort of built from that word. And, of course, there's a connection here because what happens? You sit in order to learn. Now, the suffering is due to the fact these people have not learned what they should have learned, right? It says in the text, you know us not. In other words, you have not learned something that you're supposed to learn. But they don't know what they're supposed to know. The suffering really is due to that reason. But the reward, you'll notice, is for those who have learned, and part of the reward is where they're going to sit. So we see that there's a connection in Hebrew thought here between knowing what you're supposed to know and sitting. That connection is made in Hebrew thought. It's not made in Greek thought. It's not made in English thought. It's not made in the thought process of any other language that I know of. Now, if this type of thing only happened in one of the letters, you might write it off as a coincidence, but it doesn't. We actually find that in 6 out of the 7 cases, we've got the rewards and punishments connected together through some sort of Hebrew keyword. And in all 7, they're connected together by the Hebrew meaning that you get when you spell the city name in Hebrew. You do with the Smyrna, which is the only one that's missing. And they're all connected together by the meaning of their city names. But in 6 of the 7 cases, they're connected together by yet another word, not present in the text. And in the case of one of the letters, you've actually got 2 Hebrew keywords going on. So this is too much of a coincidence to be a coincidence. It is, in fact, a pattern, obviously intended and obviously part of the design to the way these letters are structured. Now, sometimes the Hebrew thought, like these examples I've shown you, is in the text, and sometimes it's behind the text. I mean, sometimes there's an actual word there that you could translate into Hebrew with the keyword that's involved. Sometimes you've got a synonymous description, whereas you've got a description and that word is obviously part of it. And sometimes the word involved it's there, but it's really part of the thought process behind the text rather than being actually in the text. Now, it's easier to see when it's actually in the text, but it isn't always actually in the text. Like in the case of, let's see, the woman being thrown on the bed, you had a lot of different Hebrew meanings to the same word that were all present in there. And the word bed was there, the word rod was there. And of course, the tribe that supported her was in there, but you had to think about that. That was, in the case of the words bed and rod, the words were actually in the text, but the idea of the tribe that supported her, you could get that out of the same words, but it was really at the thought level, but it's still there. Now, in order to really see this stuff, of course, the more fluent you are in Hebrew, the easier it's going to be to see this stuff, because you're not going to be able to see the thoughts behind the words unless you build up a good Hebrew vocabulary and you can just simply recognize it and be able to reassemble that in your mind. That's the only way to see that. But sometimes this stuff is actually in the text, and that's a very helpful thing. Now, there are at least 2 books of the New Testament for which I think there's very good texts that'll help us restore the Hebrew thought, because in my book on the Hebrew pages of the New Testament, I present the ancient Hebrew manuscripts to the 2 books we are told were written in Hebrew, and that's the book of Hebrews and the Gospel of Matthew. And I definitely believe that the book of Hebrews, in the case of the book of Hebrews, it is the original Hebrew version. And I present a lot of evidence for that in my book, The Hebrew Pages of the New Testament. I'm not going to talk about that in detail right now, but I do talk about that in another lecture that is available on my website. I do talk about that as well in detail in my book. So if you either watch that lecture or read my book, you'll see the evidence that I believe is there for the fact that that is the original Hebrew version of Hebrews. Now, I'm not going to give as strong of an endorsement to Matthew. I do think that the Gospel of Matthew in the Hebrew text that is available from the Middle Ages is actually a very good text. And it is we do know that one of the versions available, the one that was published by Munster and Dutelet, we were told by Quincarbarus in his writings that that version was the standard version that Jewish believers in the Messiah had accepted and as their standard at the time. Now, we don't know for sure that it whether it evolved from the original Gospel according to Hebrews or not. We know from history that the Gospel according to Hebrews contained the original Hebrew Matthew. We also can safely say that there's been at least some evolution of maybe that's not a great word to use, but there's been some changes to the text from that version to what was published by Munster and described by Quincarbarus as the standard accepted text, because there are some things that were in the original version that are missing. When I say change, I don't mean serious changes, but one of the things that does seem to be present is that there seems to be some text that was in the original version that's missing from that version. However, despite those issues, the vocabulary to it is very good in terms of being a helpful thing to study. Some people have said that it's nothing but a translation from a Greek source or from a Latin source. Well, whether it is or whether it isn't, it is still a very good version to use in order to see the Hebrew thought in the Gospels, because their choice of vocabulary words was, in my opinion, pretty good and pretty helpful at restoring the Hebrew thought that is behind the discussions that are going on. Now, one of the things that I showed you in one of the previous lessons, I showed you examples of how quite often even the Aramaic version of the New Testament does not record the vocabulary words that would help us see the original Hebrew thought that is behind what is being expressed. I showed you in part 2 of this series that there definitely are places where the writers of the New Testament are recording what they are saying is indeed they're thinking in Hebrew, and what they are recording, if you reassemble the Hebrew thought, you can definitely see that Hebrew thought is there. And the Aramaic Peshitta does not always record that. Now, there are times where the Aramaic Peshitta does record it, and that's one of the reasons why I would definitely say that irregardless of what your opinion is on whether the different books of the New Testament were originally written in Greek or whether they were originally written in Aramaic, they definitely help restore the Hebrew thought to what is being said some of the time in the Aramaic text. And for that reason, it probably doesn't matter whether the Aramaic is, whether it's original or whether it is revised or whether it is a translation from the Greek text. It's worth studying because it sometimes will help you reassemble that original Hebrew thought. However, it doesn't do it all the time, and I've given you examples of places where it doesn't do it. I will say that the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew that is contained in my book on the Hebrew pages of the New Testament does it a lot. And I've got a lot of footnotes in my book on the Hebrew pages of the New Testament that help bring out the original Hebrew thought that's there. A lot of the footnotes I have, you're not going to find anywhere else. There's, just like you probably haven't heard this stuff anywhere else that I'm talking about in this series, there's a lot of footnotes in there that, as far as I know, nobody else has written about as well. And it's worth getting, even for that reason, even if you've got somebody else's copy of Matthew in English. A modern Hebrew translation might help you reassemble the Hebrew thought every now and then. However, I'm going to say this. Most modern Hebrew translations avoid using words that would confuse, and they go for clarity. And because of that, a lot of times the Hebrew thought that is behind the text can't really be seen in most of your modern Hebrew translations. They typically don't do as good of a job as the Munster text or the Dutele text of showing you the Hebrew thought that's there. Sometimes they do. Every once in a while they do. But most modern Hebrew translations are probably only worth reading out of in order to see the Hebrew thought if you can read Hebrew fluently. If you can, then it may be worth your while to study out of a Hebrew text instead of out of an English text or whatever your favorite language is. However, if your ability to study something in Hebrew is limited to doing word studies and to cross-referencing English words to looking them up in a Hebrew dictionary and trying to get more of an understanding of what that English word you're reading really means in the Hebrew, then using a modern translation probably isn't going to help you too much. Looking at the Munster Dutele text, it is something that probably is useful to someone who is limited in their abilities to doing word studies, because there is a lot of fascinating things in there, and a lot of them, of course, I do footnote. One other topic that is worth covering is the Q theory. Now, many modern theologians in the church have recognized that what I'm telling you here definitely has some truth to it and has some validity. And they have recognized the fact that there is definitely some Semitic thought. When I say Semitic, that's a generic term for Hebrew and or Aramaic, since Hebrew and Aramaic are very closely related. They're sister languages that share a lot of the same vocabulary words. And there are a lot of Christian theologians who teach that the Synoptic Gospels, which record a lot of the same content, were drawing from an original Aramaic gospel that is now lost to us that they want to call Q. Now, I'm going to show you a few of their arguments that are being used for that and a few of my arguments that are used for that. However, I think that that's close to the truth, but not exactly the truth. I think that what they were drawing from was a text that was ultimately in Hebrew. It may have had some Hebrew and Aramaic in it. I believe that Q is not an unknown gospel that's now lost. I believe that Q was the gospel according to the Hebrews. And that what modern theologians identify as Q really is the gospel according to the Hebrews. Now, a gospel according to the Hebrews is not publicly available at the moment, but it probably is available somewhere within the Vatican archives or in an Orthodox vault somewhere, locked away from the public. However, that's probably where the Greek version of Matthew, Mark, and Luke got all of their content from. Now, just to show you some examples of why this is being taught, let's take a look at a few places. Here's one example from Matthew 11:19, which is the same as Luke 7:35. The two Greek texts are recording the same event, and they almost agree except for one word. Because here it says, in Matthew, wisdom is justified by her works, but in the same verse in Luke, it says wisdom is justified by her children. Now, if you could see the screen here, you could see that the word works and the word children are both spelled the same way in Hebrew. Because in Hebrew, you could spell either one of these, Ben, Nun, Yud, He. And the reason that this difference exists between what Matthew records and what Luke records is probably because they were both translating from a Hebrew source text that said Ben, Nun, Yud, He, and one of them translated one way and the other one translated it the other. And so the Greek preserves one translation in one text and the other translation in the others. Now, another example is found where Matthew 22:22 contains a verse that is parallelly also recorded in Luke 20:26. Click below to subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to visit my website at www.messiahalive.net. That's www.messiahalive.net. And Charles Cutler Torrey's book that he titled Our Translated Gospels. And in that book, he argues that each of the four Gospels were translated from an Aramaic source text. Now, he's not arguing in favor of the Q theory. He's actually arguing in favor of the idea that Greek Matthew was translated from an Aramaic source text of Matthew, that the Greek Luke was translated from an Aramaic text of Luke, that Luke was in Aramaic before it was translated into Greek. He argues the same thing for John, that the book of John was originally written in Aramaic and translated to Greek. And of course, I think he was definitely right about John. And in some ways, when it comes to Mark and Luke, it's sort of hard to pin this down because in some cases, since Mark and Luke were both pulling from the gospel according to the Hebrews and basically translating everything from the content that was in there, if they weren't really adding their own original text, then it's a little bit harder to see, proof of original language due to that reason. But anyways, and it probably doesn't really matter in that case, because if everything they were recording was coming from that, then ultimately that is our source that we're describing as the original. Another example is found where Mark 23:31 records the same thing as Luke 11:48. And in one of them it says, you are sons, and in the other it says, you build. Now, the Hebrew phrase, banim atem, which is what's found in Dutule, manuscript of the Gospel of Matthew, it can be translated either as we see it in the Greek, Matthew 23:31, or as you see it in the Greek, Luke 11:48, depending upon how you vocalize the word here. You would not pronounce you are sons the same way you would pronounce you build in Hebrew, but you would spell them the same way. And that's why, and of course, the men who were writing the gospel, of course, were looking at a written text. And it got translated one way in one gospel and differently in Luke. Yet another example can be found in place where Matthew 12:50, Mark 3:35, and Luke 8:21 all record a phrase that can be spelled identically the same way in Hebrew, achi, but they interpret it slightly differently in the three Gospels. Now, to some people, this kind of looks like a mistake. Did one guy get it right and the other guy get it wrong? Well, maybe, maybe not. Actually, one thing about Hebrew, one thing that's maybe sort of unique to Hebrew that is not true of Greek or English or a lot of other languages, is that there's frequently a lot of ambiguous ways to interpret the text. And many people, many rabbis over the ages have taught that it was something that God did intentionally. Just to give you an example, the very first sentence in Torah actually is ambiguous, because where it says, the very first verse of Genesis reads in most English translations, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." That's how most Bibles open up. But the phrase "beginning" there, it could be a time reference. It could mean "in the beginning," in which case that would be a reference to time. But another way to read that is through the first one, through the beginner, through the person who began everything. God created the heavens and the earth. Now, is the correct translation through the beginner or through in the beginning? By in the beginner, I don't mean someone who's beginning to learn something. I mean someone who began something. Well, it's ambiguous in the text. It could be interpreted either way. And certainly if you believe in the gospel, then you're probably going to embrace the idea that God was trying to say both things at the same time. Because we know, and that is why in the Gospel of John, he says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and that through him everything was made." The reason John opens up his Gospel that way is because he's trying to expound on that alternative meaning. He's trying to write to an audience that probably already understood the fact. In fact, one of the reasons I believe he did write in Aramaic is I think he was writing to an audience that already understood that this text had some ambiguity. And he was trying to bring to the front of their mind the fact that God created the world through somebody else, and that somebody else, of course, was the Word or his Son. And so it's not impossible that the reason we see Matthew recording a source text one way and Luke recording the same source text a different way, it's not impossible for that to be going on in the original text. It is maybe quite possible that the Gospel according to Hebrews was trying to convey two different thoughts at the same time. And for that reason, we've got one Gospel conveying the thought one way and another Gospel conveying the thought another way. Now, some people, the fact that the Gospel according to Hebrews isn't publicly available bothers some people, but it may very well be that the reason we don't have it is because, maybe God doesn't want us to have it right now. Maybe it's because God knows it would confuse people. And maybe there's some things we need to learn about interpreting the same text multiple ways. Because, let's face it, if it was available, people would be saying, well, Luke messed up. Or, Mark messed up. When in reality, maybe they were just recording different aspects of what that original Gospel according to Hebrews was trying to tell us. And maybe it was trying to say more than one thing at the same time. God does that a lot in the Tanakh, and maybe he did it some in the Gospel according to the Hebrews as well. But whatever the case is, we have what we have. God's in control. We have what he wants us to have at the moment. Okay, that's about all I've got at this time. I could talk about more, but I want to keep this short, reasonably short. There's some more examples I could go through, but I think this is enough to give you the general idea and, of course, answer some of the questions that had popped up after the end of my second lesson. I go into even more detail on this in my book, The Hebrew pages of the New Testament. I also talk about some of these examples I've got is in my other book on the 7 cities. There's so much Hebrew thought in the New Testament. I really can't even put it all in one book. But I would encourage you to, if you want to learn more about this, I would encourage you to get a hold of a copy of my book, The Hebrew Pages of the New Testament, which, yes, has a translation of Hebrews, it has a translation of Matthew, but it has so much more than that. The analysis of those texts is very well worth reading, and the explanations about the Hebrew thought in those books is well worth reading as well. And it's a great place to get started learning about the Hebrew thought in the New Testament. Like I said, there's also information about this in my book on the 7 cities, and also my book on the 42 journey pattern contains a few places where there's Hebrew thought in the New Testament. I think I actually included that example earlier of James 4:7 in there. I may have included some more. I don't remember exactly how many I included, because the 42 journey pattern is certainly an example of Hebrew thought, and it is used in the New Testament. So in that sense, every part of the book certainly presents Hebrew thought in the New Testament from that standpoint. But other examples, kind of similar to the ones that I presented here in these lessons, I think are probably there too. Let me just encourage you to keep in mind that, of course, the New Testament was written by Jewish men, except, of course, Luke, who was certainly heavily influenced by Jewish men himself. And he's the only Gentile writer of the Scriptures. We shouldn't be surprised to find Hebrew thought, but I think there's probably been a lot of overemphasis on the Greek in the church, who feel like the Greek is everything, and that if we want to truly understand the New Testament, we need to learn Greek well and crack open a Greek dictionary here, left and right, and everywhere we study. And the Hebrew doesn't matter anymore. Well, the truth of the matter is that if we don't have the entire New Testament in Hebrew, then it probably means it probably elevates our need to learn Hebrew, not diminish our need to learn Hebrew. Because in order to reassemble the original Hebrew thought, we need to be able to think about Hebrew fluently enough that we can see the thought behind the text, and not just cases where the Hebrew words are contained in the text. Let me encourage you to study this topic more. It's a fascinating study. Shalom, and this is Josephil saying, may God be with all of your studies of the Scripture. Click below to subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to visit my website at www.messiahalive.net. That's www.messiahalive.net.